So we're looking at chapter 5 right now with this lecture and the next lecture. And what I've done is I've broken it up into two lectures because it's a fairly long and fairly in-depth amount of information that you need. I would highly recommend reading the chapter again because just like with the drama chapters, this one is a compilation that I'm doing of years of teaching. And so there's information in this lecture that's not in the book, but there's also information, very good information in the book that's not going to be in my lecture. So again, I recommend watching these videos and reading the book. Don't skip the reading, especially on this chapter since research is the main focus of this class. So what we're looking at the beginning here is the sources, looking at your books, your journals, databases, etc. We also need to look at the audience. So we need to look at the sources and yours. So you're writing for a particular audience. Your sources, who are your sources writing for? So there's a wonderful database called JSTOR that I love in the school's databases. However, almost all of the articles are coming from professional journals, which are written by PhDs for PhDs, which doesn't mean that it's not a good source, but then you have to realize that you need to change the diction. You need to make the language a little less academic because your audience are not PhDs. So I hope you understand what I mean that by then looking at your audience and how that relates to your sources audiences. All right, so the argument you're going to write, it's got to address who you're writing for. So I'm not going to write for this guy the same way I'd write for probably most of you. All right, it's a completely different audience, and you have to take that into account. So you've also got to ask, what are we're talking about in the source? How's it being discussed? What are the different positions? All right, so that's when you're dealing with your sources. Now, visualizing your research. Uh, when you're writing a research paper, your topic is what we actually see as far as your subject matter. But the research is everything that went into what we see. All the information you gathered, some that may show up on the page, some that may not show up on the page, but informs what you have to say. All right, so it's kind of like the Titanic. It's a little like an iceberg. The majority of the iceberg is below the water. Now, with search terms, when you start doing your research, when you're using the internet, you want to use a variety of terms. Uh, don't just use one term all the way through. Try to come up with as many different terms as you can. So this isn't related to literature, but as a term, if you were going to write a paper on climate change, you wouldn't want to just keep searching climate change. Maybe you'd want to go to global warming or environmental impact of weather, things like that. You want to use a variety of terms to come up with as many sources. And you will find as you're researching some of the resources that you come up with will also use alternate terms, and you can use them to come up with these alternate terms. Uh, and this also allows you a narrowing of results by doing that. Now, evaluating sources. This is very important, especially now that we have the internet. I mean, because any fool sitting in his mother's basement with a laptop can put information on the internet. It doesn't mean that the information is good, so you have to evaluate the sources you're going to use to make sure you have credible sources. So there's an awful lot of free websites that allow you to kind of cheat on literature papers, right? And you want to try to stay away from those where they just summarize the novel or the play or the short story. All right, so what you want to do when you're looking at your sources, you want to look at your author's credentials. If you cannot find an author for a source, you probably don't want to use that source. There's got to be a reason why there's no author. Uh, and this goes for anything, not just literature. So, who is the author? Why should you believe the author? What expertise does the author have in the field? So, an example of this, I was researching for a class once. I was in the school's databases and I found a really good article. But it turned out that the person who'd written the article was working on his master's uh, degree at Wayne State. Well, for me, I mean, that doesn't mean he's not well educated, but he hasn't completed the degree. He's not an expert in his field yet. This guy was still becoming an expert, so it wasn't something I felt confident or comfortable bringing into classroom as part of my research on whatever topic it was. I forget what I was researching. So you've got to look at that, the credentials. Now, you also have to judge the credibility of the work. So with books, you can find reviews as to whether it's a credible book or not. The JSTOR that I mentioned earlier is very good for that. There's lots of reviews of professional books in there. For magazines, journals, you've got to try to figure that on your own. Whether it's respectable. I mean, you can see that U.S. News and Report would probably be respectable, but People Magazine or the National Enquirer, maybe not so much, right? With journals, try to stick with peer-reviewed journals. So what I mean that about by that, most of the databases in the schools databases, the journals in there are peer-reviewed, and what that means is that the articles have been written by professionals, and then other professionals in the field have fact-checked the articles before they go into the journal. So there's kind of like a double security there, a double warranty, because the professional wrote it and he or she probably did really good research, and then somebody else who's also a professional in the field double checked it. Make sure you got sources at an appropriate level. So like I said, JSTOR is PhDs writing for other PhDs, and you just need to be aware of that that's probably not appropriate for your audience. It doesn't mean that you can't use it, but then you have to adapt it to your audience. And as much as possible, try to stick with current sources. With literature, this isn't so important. It is a little important, but I mean, you can go back for Shakespeare's play and find resources at the time he was writing that are credible sources. Uh, but with other topics, especially when you go into other classes, you're going to want to make sure you're current. Now, for websites, you always want to find an About Us tab. And this goes for any class, not this class, just this class, but any class you're doing research for. If you can't find an About Us tab, it's probably not a credible website, and you want to stay away from that. You want to find out who the author is, where his source of information came from, and who published. And not that the publisher will change whether or not it's a credible source, but certain publishers are biased certain ways, and you need to be aware of that. Some have liberal bias, some have conservative bias, some are a little bit more objective. Okay, and evaluating the layout, just kind of look at it. Don't worry about that at a glance. All right, databases. These are pretty safe, the school databases, because like I said, the majority of them are peer-reviewed journals, so using the school's databases, you're in good shape. There's a really good tutorial on the library's homepage of how to use databases, and you just go through that very quickly. Be careful that it's appropriate to your audience, though, like I said. Make sure that it's written at a level that it's going to work for your audience. All right, if you have an annotated bibliography, and you won't for this class, for some classes you might. You want to list all the relevant information. Then you write what's important about the source, how it's going to be integrating into your paper, and you also have to include any quotations and page numbers you're hoping to use. So an annotated bibliography, unlike what you'll be doing for this class, is much longer. It can be pages long because of that, and you may end up having to do that. All right, so that's the end of part one. We'll go into part two of actually writing the paper next.